Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host, Jordan, joined by my good friend, Max, aka AirPods Max Patton. Of course, with his AirPods Max. Love that blue color, by the way.
Thank you.
Welcome to a podcast of us drooling over things we wish we had. This is part one of a two-part series of basically the EVs Europe gets that we don't, and we're jealous. So, I figure a good one to start it right off with is the Honda E. And I guess before I get to that, let's preface this. We kind of selected 10 intriguing, all relatively affordable. I mean, they all fall within 20, like high 20s to low to mid 30s as far as the price. So no crazy, weird one-off luxury vehicles. They're all attainable, kind of everyday people vehicles. And basically, it's like cars that we would eye for ourselves if we were in Europe. Of course, Europe gets a lot of the cars we get in the US, but these are exclusive, sometimes for better or for worse. And we're going to kind of go through some of them, talk about some of the specs, some of the design, what we think of them. And honestly, if you're in Europe, this is probably a lot of really good buying advice. And if you're in America, you can cry with us and enjoy looking at the beauties such as this Honda E. I love the Honda E. Now, we recently did a podcast on Honda's electrification strategy. This is like the only current EV they have on sale, which sadly it is only in Europe. I think there's a Honda Clarity, of course, but this is cool. I love the design. We've drooled over this many times. And I just want to say, when you go to their website, in this case, we're on the UK website, it just starts right off with saying, it's got power. Does it, though? What do you think of the E, Max?
I think the E is awesome. I agree with you. It looks beautiful, and it does honestly have power. 0 to 60 in 8.3 seconds for a city hatchback, which is what this is really good, even if it's not fast in the EV terminology. And it's doubly painful because not only do we not get the Honda E here, but we don't have its cool like wingtip cameras because our highway regulators don't think that should be legal in the US. So it's just super futuristic, really out there EV. Yes, it's questionably, it's not high range and it's very expensive, but it is undeniably beautiful. It is an iconic design. It's got like this really cool interior too, with like a dashboard that can display a virtual aquarium and all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, you can see all the digital mirrors here. It's just cool technology. Very, very good design as far as interior and exterior. And they actually made probably the only Honda steering wheel I like. So that's impressive. Props to you, Honda. Now, if only this was in the States, and honestly, if only it was a little bit cheaper. So we'll mention some of the specs really briefly here. You can get it from anywhere from 134 to 152 horsepower. For those of you looking at kilowatt, it's 100 to 113 kilowatt motor. Is this rear wheel drive?
Yes, it is.
I think, yeah, this is one of the only rear-wheel drive cars on our entire list, so that's pretty cool. 232 pound-feet of torque, that is impressive. And now it's a 35 kilowatt-hour battery with up to 50 kilowatt DC fast charging. That's not that impressive for the charging, but it's a small battery, and it's a city car primarily. Something else I should preface is, for almost all these cars, they are designed for the European market, which means they can level 2 charge at about 22 kilowatts or up to. That's the European standard. Whereas in the US, our level 2 typical charging is up to like 7 kilowatts, sometimes more in very niche circumstances. But that's one way Europe tends to be ahead of us in the type 2 charging industry. As far as range, we have 211 kilometers or 135 miles WLTP, so that might be a bit optimistic. But in the city, that might be fairly accurate. And as Max said, 0 to 60 in 8.3 seconds. Not blisteringly fast, but does it need to be? That's the thing with a lot of these cars. 0 to 60 is just what we've decided as humanity for some reason as a very important spec. When in reality, on these city cars, I think you're probably going to be happier with 0 to 30 or 0 to 45 times, which I think this is probably pretty good with. Do you know the pricing on this?
Yes, they start at 37,500, I believe, pounds for the British listeners out there, with the dollar being as strong as it is right now, that actually equates pretty well to US dollars. But of course, you can't buy one here. But if you could, you could think of it as like the next gen version of the BMW i3, a very expensive, very stylish city car with not a ton of range. It does also have DC fast charging, we should mention, so 50 kilowatts peak rate. And I don't know if Kyle did a charging test when he drove his, but I think it's a smallish battery, so it should charge pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's fine. Next on the list is something I personally wish very much that we had here, and that would be the Fiat 500e. Now, Max and I have recently tested, which may not be up at the time, but on Out of Spec Reviews, we'll have a video on the outgoing Fiat 500e, the one of the prior gen that has been discontinued now in the US. So this is the new generation Fiat 500e. Looks fantastic. In a lot of ways, doesn't really look that much different. Just subtle design cues like more sleek and modern headlight and daytime running light designs. Really interesting wheels. Also super cool colors. In this case, for our visual listeners and watchers on YouTube, it's kind of like a pink rosé kind of color. Really, I wish we had this car so badly. I rode in one in Germany and was so impressed. And, the issues I had with the one we tested, granted, it's very cheap, so the issues are okay. They're justified. But the range is not great. It's very much a city car. But in this new one, the range is 190 miles or so. Now that's, I think, WLTP as well. So probably a bit less in reality, maybe a bit more if you're doing slow city driving, but that is a very, very usable range. I would be super happy with that. 85 kilowatt DC fast charging for its 42 kilowatt hour battery. That's also pretty solid. And as far as power, it does get a little bit of a power bump, 116 horsepower or 87 kilowatt and 162 pound-feet of torque. That is slightly more powerful than the one we drove today as of recording this. And that was still pretty fast. I mean, we had a lot of fun. Still not that fast, 0 to 60 in I think 9 seconds. But it starts at 28 grand.
Slower. Yeah, you look at 0 to 60, but that is for good reason. Like you were talking about, that amazing range is being delivered by largely a much bigger battery. So it seems like that very marginal power bump doesn't really offset the weight increase. But that 0 to 20, 0 to 30, I think is still going to be really respectable.
Yeah. So that's a very compelling option. Honestly, if I was in Europe, this would probably be my first choice. I mean, it's fun to think of all these as good choices because they're all forbidden fruit for us over here in the States. But if I was in Europe, or if I could pick one of these cars to come to the US, it would probably be this one. I would have it, I would dress it up like the vintage looking Fiat 500 I used to have, and just get every upgrade imaginable, and which is probably kind of dumb, but I would still do it. But next on the list is the
you mentioned the killer of this, £28,000 starting price.
Sorry, yeah, very good price.
Over 10 grand less than the Honda E we just looked at, and functionally this is a superior car. So that's kind of aside from the fact that it has 2 doors, but it's awesome.
Yeah, maybe not quite as powerful, but I think it's also weighs less. You have to look at power to weight ratio, not just raw power. This charges faster, has bigger battery, more range, and it's cheaper than the Honda E. I don't know how I could choose Honda E over this, except the Honda E has fantastically cool styling, and it's very unique. But I like the Fiat 500e. But next on the list is the Kia Soul EV, which the new generation. Now, Max, you've recently driven the previous generation, is that right, for your cheap car series?
The 2017 model year in the US was made until 2019, but once they've refreshed the Soul, they kept selling the gas one in the US, but they axed plans for this new EV, which is sad because Canada gets it and our European friends across the pond do, but we don't.
Very sad. What'd you think of the previous one? Is this something you really wish we had here?
The previous one, if we were looking at gas Soul, wouldn't be that big of a difference, right? They facelifted all of the Souls, but this new Soul EV, compared to the one I drove, has a dramatically bigger battery, dramatically more range. It's more powerful, which means it's actually fast, which is really nice. It's actually equivalent, I think, in horsepower terms, or kilowatt terms, whichever you prefer, to the Kia Soul Turbo, the 1.6T, but it's electric. So instead of having that, turbocharged, like whine with the CVT, GT. You get a smooth, linear, progressive delivery of torque. So I think this is awesome. All the reviews from our favorite British car reviewers seem to bear that out. This seems to be a really awesome car, offered at a pretty good price too, that we don't get.
Yeah, it's funny. The Fiat 500e also has comparable specs to its torque brother, the Torquey gas version, which is fun. That means they're somewhat compelling to drive, just naturally because they're electric, but also the fact that they have specs to compare with a torque internal combustion engine or a turbo, sorry, one is awesome. So specs wise on the Kia Soul EV, 201 horsepower or 150 kilowatt motor, and then 291 pound-feet of torque. That is crazy amounts of torque and solid horsepower. Now there's a base model with 134 horsepower, still decent, but I would for sure get the bigger one. Of course, the bigger, more powerful one also has a bigger battery, so 64 kilowatt hours, and I think up to 100 kilowatt DC fast charging, although some sources said 75, which is interesting because the prior generation had CHAdeMO, and now as of 2020, this has DC or CCS, which is really cool. Now the base battery is 40 kilowatt hours, so definitely less. But as far as the range with the bigger battery, 243 miles, that's fantastic. That's on par with like Chevy Bolt over here in the States. WLTP says 282 miles. I don't know, somewhere in that realm, which is really, really fantastic range, about 450 kilometers of city driving. 0 to 60 in 7.9 seconds, so not blisteringly fast, but faster than the Honda E, which says in its press release on its website that it is fast. So, by the transitive property, this must be fast. But the price, I think I found that it was $43,000. I think that was for the upgraded model. So the base one, I think, is in the high 30s. That is definitely a bit more of a premium price tag, but I think could be justified because of the really impressive range and decent charging and decent storage space as well.
Yes, and depending on which European country you're in, you do get incentives, just like we do get in America now. They're being restructured. But in Europe, I think the price can be brought down to basically just over £32,000 if you option it right in the UK, and if you get that plug-in credit. So that's great because it has a big battery. It qualifies. It is very much an EV. So super exciting. It's just kind of expensive, but it is, like you said, it's Bolt comparable range with arguably a lot better styling and practicality, being a Soul, being a big box. And also, I think in the styling department, just to describe for our audio listeners, it kind of looks like a mini Range Rover now. That's how like the new Souls look. They have facelifted them, and maybe it's polarizing. I like it. It's got the slim new LED headlights. It's two-tone colors as you can get with the roof. I think it's really sharp.
Nice, cool, boxy shape. It would look great with a roof rack, maybe a roof box or a basket. Of course, that would cut into your efficiency, but it's okay. It's all about the looks. Am I right? Plastic cladding as well, which is it's just becoming a trend, which I think would make this look pretty cool. I think this would look awesome lifted with some bigger tires, which would be absolutely pointless for how anyone drives a Kia Soul, but yeah. How much can I destroy the range of this car? But let's move on to a brand we don't even get in the States. Granted, it is GM kind of umbrella-esque, but the Opel Mokka-E. Now, this is interesting. The last two cars we're talking about in this part one of this series are actually a shared platform. They both share the ECMP, which is Opel and Peugeot, and there's one other as well. But this is the Mokka-E. So these last two cars do have identical specs as far as motor and torque, as well as battery and charging. So 136 horsepower or 100 kilowatt, 192 pound-feet of torque. So not a performance monster. But just look at this branding they use. They have it sitting in a skateboard park, dressed in bright green with two-tone black hood and roof with like chrome for some reason. And then the skateboard park is like painted partially green. There's a dude looks like he's from Portland on his phone, although I think he's not from Portland because this is Europe. But yeah, the Mokka or Mocha, I don't know how you say it, but what do you think of this thing?
Mokke for our audio listeners, and it sounds
Mokka-E,
like a Sesame
yeah.
Street character saying Mach-E, like the Ford vehicle, but of course now it's Opel.
Yeah. As far as battery, it has 50 kilowatt hour battery, up to 100 kilowatt DC fast charging. Those are acceptable specs, I will say. I think all of these cars have about 100 kilowatt, except the Honda and Fiat fall a bit short. The Honda quite a bit short, but 100 kilowatt DC fast charging on a battery this size is really quite solid. And again, with all these electric cars, you have to realize the charging curve is more important than the actual peak charging rate, because some companies will advertise a peak charging rate and then only have it for like 2 minutes. So it's all marketing jargon. As far as range, 322 kilometers about there, which is 240 miles or so range WLTP, which is decent. That's acceptable. 0 to 60 in 9 seconds, which is about what I would expect for a small crossover being pushed along by the relatively weak motor. Starts around 35,500 euros, which is, I'd say, probably somewhat competitive. I do love their photo gallery. It's just every car they used was green, and there's green surroundings. The buildings are like painted green. It's kind of fun. Probably some subconscious delivery of their green messaging. Pure electricity, I guess. But what do you think of the Mokka-E?
Yeah, I think it's great. Another one that kind of, I think, does the two-tone styling with the black roof on the model they keep showing on the website with the green color scheme. And, not super powerful in terms of the motor, but torquey enough and lightweight enough. And 0 to 60, 9 seconds isn't terrible if you're comparing gas small crossovers. I keep banging on about this, but like nowadays, if you have a 1.5 or 1.6, liter displacement engine with a turbocharger, that's not going to be a particularly pleasurable powertrain either. So I think these small motors are nothing to sneeze at, especially when you consider that this is mostly going to be driven in an urban or around town setting where you're going to realize more of that range because it's electric. It's more efficient at those settings. I think we should also mention that we keep talking about the kilometers and the miles rating from WLTP. So the European test cycle where they get those ranges from is notoriously more generous than our EPA's own test cycle. So you have to consider it's a little bit inflated compared to the numbers you'll get from most US manufacturers, because we use EPA figures and our EPA just seems to test more in the real world. WLTP is a little bit more best case scenario. You're driving at slower speeds.
Granted, something to defend their system is a lot of vehicles in Europe and even the cities and speed limits are a bit less. There's a lot more of the city driving versus in the US, we're a bit more spread out. We do have a lot more highway commuting. So it is possible that they would sort of correlate hand in hand. And I'd actually love to develop some sort of test to like analyze that. But it's funny, I just want to mention here, it talks about the strong silent type, just how quiet it is with an EV. And literally there's this guy and this girl, and she like has fallen asleep on his shoulder, and he looks like he's hanging on by a thread, also about to fall asleep. So that's them leading into the electrification of their drivetrain, I guess. So I think to tie into the next car, same platform architecture as the Peugeot E208, which is the electric cousin of the Peugeot 208, which is one of my favorite vehicles on this list, and I think a very interesting looking one. It's hard to make CUVs and hatches look unique in some ways, but I think Peugeot does a excellent job with that, especially with the front lighting design and characteristics. That their logo is like a lion, and literally the lights look like a lion just like sliced through the car with its claws and just left daytime running lights in its stead. So that's pretty cool.
A cyber lion. That's the new Peugeot logo.
So this one I think looks fantastic as far as exterior, but also the interior. Let me show right here. Look at these cockpit switches. I mean, this is like what you'd see in a Mustang GT350 here in the States. It's kind of a flattened top and bottom on the steering wheel, and just cool toggle switches on the interior. Very clean, simplistic. A whole lot of carbon fiber. Not sure how I feel about that. A lot of piano black, which looks fantastic in renderings or photographs. But not my favorite as far as living with it. But I love seeing this blue and this yellow. this is definitely one of my favorites. And let's talk specs. I mean, just a refresher, because it's basically all the same: 136 horsepower, 100 kilowatt, 192 pound-feet of torque, 50 kilowatt-hour battery, 100 kilowatt DC fast charging. All the same. About 225 miles WLTP, so also comparable. I think it's a little smaller and weighs a little less. And so the 0 to 60 time is quoted to be 8.1 seconds, which is a bit faster. Also, because of the size being a bit smaller, that's possibly why it's a little bit cheaper. I don't know if we mentioned, oh yeah, we did early, but the Opel Mokka-E was 35,000-ish euros. This one starts at about 30,000. So yeah, comparable, all in that same realm. What do you think of the...
It seems like you're paying the SUV tax for the Mokka-E. Even, I mean, they're both, crossover-ish vehicles, but this being more of that traditional hatchback. I mean, it is a hatchback. They don't even try to call it a crossover. Whereas the Opel Mokka-E might have a little bit more ground clearance for your off-roading adventures, or just, a little bit more of that SUV cabin space.
Yeah. I really, really like this thing. I think... This is like the car, if I go to Europe and have to rent a car, this is probably something I would look for. I even love their trims, the Allure Premium Plus, the Active Premium Plus. Pretty intriguing. I just like Peugeot in general. They make great salt and pepper grinders. I don't know, but that's the first 5 of this list we wanted to mention of Europe EVs we wish we got. And these are things Max and I would just look at for fun, so we thought we'd bring you along for the ride. Let us know what you think of these 5 vehicles. We didn't list them in any sort of order. It was just kind of randomly selected. And so join us for part 2 at a really soon later date, where we can look at the next 5 on our list, especially ending with something very spicy. What do you think, Max, of this 5? What's your take?
I think it's a strong 5, and I agree. I hope, to at least have the chance to see them or drive some of them at some point. I am really, I think, most broken about the Honda E. But all of these are just honestly great value budget EV options. Everyone always talks about how in these states we don't get these. And to your earlier point about European driving involving more cities and thus getting more EV driving range because people are driving at lower speeds, I think that might be part of it, right? Every time we see like a European EV, or let's just say a global EV platform, come to the States, we're usually the ones who get the bigger battery pack, the longer wheelbase, the more expensive version like the ID Buzz or the ID4, right? We get those because Europeans think that us Americans just drive at ridiculously fast speeds for way too long, and maybe we do, but we just have higher expectations, and thus our prices get pushed up. So it's nice to see more of these modest, kind of smaller battery city vehicles that are honestly really great. And I think it would be just so nice if we got something here.
Lots of forbidden fruit. Of course, you can all import these in 25 years when maybe we'll be listening to this podcast again and revisiting it to remember what it was like back in the day. So thanks for joining on part 1 of this series, and we'll see you in part 2 very soon. Let us know what you think of these cars. Which ones would you like? Or if you are overseas and lucky enough, which ones do you own and why? We'll see you very soon. Another episode of the Out of Spec podcast.